Tonight, we're learning about the Great Molasses Flood, also known as the Boston Molasses Disaster. This disaster occurred on Wednesday, January 15th, 1919, in the North End neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. A large storage tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of molasses, weighing approximately 13,000 short tons or 12,000 metric tons, burst, and the resultant wave of molasses rushed through the streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour, killing 21 people and injuring 150. The event occurred and entered local folklore, and residents reported for decades afterwards that the area still smelled of molasses on hot summer days. Molasses can be fermented to produce ethanol, the active ingredient in alcoholic beverages and a key component in munitions. The disaster occurred at the Purity Distilling Company facility at 529 Commercial Street near Kenny Square. A considerable amount of molasses had been stored there by the company, which used the Harborside Commercial Street tank to offload molasses from ships and store it for transfer by pipeline to the Purity Ethanol plant, situated between Willow Street and Everites Way in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The molasses tank stood 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, and contained as much as 2.3 million U.S. gallons. On January 15, 1919, temperatures in Boston had risen above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, climbing rapidly from the frigid temperatures of the preceding days. And the previous day, a ship had delivered a fresh load of molasses, which had been warmed to reduce its viscosity for transfer, possibly due to the thermal expansion of the older, colder molasses already inside the tank. The tank burst open and collapsed at approximately 12:30 p.m. Witnesses reported that they felt the ground shake and heard a roar as it collapsed, a long rumble similar to the passing of an elevated train. Others reported a tremendous crashing, a deep growling, a thunderclap like bang, ang, 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 and a sound like a machine gun, as the rivets shot out of the tank. The density of molasses is about 1.4 metric tons per cubic meter, 40% more dense than water, resulting in the molasses having a great deal of potential energy. The collapse translated this energy into a wave of molasses, 25 feet high at its peak, moving 35 miles per hour. The wave was of sufficient force to drive steel panels of the burst tank against the girders of the adjacent Boston Elevated Railway's Atlantic Avenue structure and tip a streetcar momentarily off of the L's tracks. Stephen Puleo describes how nearby buildings were swept off their foundations and crushed. Several blocks were flooded to a depth of 2 to 3 feet. Puleo quotes a Boston Post report. Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggle to form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise. The Boston Globe reported that people were picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet. Others had debris hurled at them from the rush of sweet-smelling air. A truck was picked up and hurled into Boston Harbor. After the initial wave, the molasses became viscous, exacerbated by the cold temperatures, trapping those caught in the wave and making it even more difficult to rescue them. About 150 people were injured, and 21 people and several horses were killed. Some were crushed and drowned by the molasses, or by the debris that it carried within. The wounded included people, horses, and dogs. Coughing fits became one of the most common ailments after the initial blast. Edwards Park wrote of one child's experience in a 1983 article for Smithsonian. Anthony DiStasio, walking homeward with his sisters from the Michelangelo School, was picked up by the wave and carried, tumbling on its crest, almost as though he were surfing. Then he grounded the molasses, rolled him like a pebble as the wave was diminished. He heard his mother call his name and couldn't answer. His throat was clogged with the smothering goo. He passed out, then opened his eyes to find 3 of his 4 sisters staring at him. First to the scene were 116 cadets under the direction of Lieutenant Commander H.J. Copeland from the USS Nantucket, a training ship of the Massachusetts Nautical School, now the Massachusetts Maritime Academy, that was docked nearby at the playground pier. The cadets ran several blocks toward the accident and entered into the knee-deep flood of molasses to pull out survivors, while others worked to keep curious onlookers from getting in the way of the rescuers. The Boston Police, Red Cross, Army, and Navy personnel soon arrived. Some nurses from the Red Cross dove into the molasses, while others tended to the injured, keeping them warm and feeding the exhausted workers. Many of these people worked through the night, and the injured were so numerous that doctors and surgeons set up a makeshift hospital in a nearby building. Rescuers found it difficult to make their way through the syrup to help the victims, and 4 days elapsed before they stopped searching. Many of the dead were so glazed over in molasses that they were hard to recognize. Other victims were swept into the Boston Harbor and were found 3 to 4 months after the disaster. In the wake of the accident, 119 residents brought a class action lawsuit against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which had bought Purity Distilling in 1917. It was one of the first class action suits in Massachusetts and is considered a milestone in paving the way for modern corporate regulation. The company claimed that the tank had been blown up by anarchists because some of the alcohol produced was to be used in making munitions. But a court-appointed auditor found USIA responsible after 3 years of hearings, and the company ultimately paid out $628,000 in damages, $11 million in 2023, adjusted for inflation. Relatives of those killed reportedly received around $7,000 per victim, equivalent to $123,000 in 2023. Cleanup crews used salt water from a fireboat to wash away the molasses and sand to absorb it. And the harbor was brown with molasses until summer. The cleanup in the immediate area took weeks, with several hundred people contributing to the effort. And it took longer to clean the rest of the greater Boston and its suburbs. Rescue workers, cleanup crews, and sightseers had tracked molasses through the streets and spread it to subway platforms, to the seats inside trains and streetcars, to pay telephones, handsets, and into homes, and to countless other places. It was reported that everything a Bostonian touched was sticky. On January 15th, 2019, for the 100th anniversary of the event, a ceremony was held in remembrance. Ground-penetrating radar was used to identify the exact location of the tank from 1919. The concrete slab base for the tank remains in place, approximately 20 inches below the surface of the baseball diamond at Langone Park. Attendees of the ceremony stood in a circle, marking the edge of the tank. The 21 names of those who died in or as a result of the flood were read aloud. Many laws and regulations governing construction were changed as a direct result of the disaster, including requirements for oversight by a licensed architect and civil engineer.
Eu fui lutar boxe, mas na época ele tinha 45 anos de idade.
À l'époque, Miles avait 45 ans.